the next thing you know, your blood sugar is spiked, your uric acid goes up, your body's in this state where it thinks it needs to store fat, and you're damaging how insulin is able to do its job, and setting the stage for these issues that we talk about that are related to our food consumption, the chronic degenerative conditions like the heart disease, the diabetes, the obesity, and some forms of cancer that are ranked by the World Health Organization as the #1 cause of death on our planet, not COVID.
Welcome to Growth Minds. Whether it's your first time here or you've been here before, I'm curious to know what it is that brought you here. And if you can, smash that like button below. It really helps spread our message to more people. All right, on to the episode. All right, David, thanks so much for coming on to Growth Minds.
It's good that we stayed in the batter's box. Who knew we had such technical challenges today, but off we go.
Off we go. And we had some benefits to that restart. So I wanted to start off with the chart that you have in one of your books, which compares the ancestor diets with the typical Western diets that we have today. And the biggest difference that I saw is the fat levels. So with our ancestors, about 3/4 were consumption of fat in their diets compared to around 1/5, about 20% in our Western diet. Obviously, these numbers can change, but the drastic differences was shocking for me. So what were the changes that have happened since our ancestors have since their times, and what does this mean for like our longevity and our health, given that we have such low fat levels? Like, how does this change our
everyday Well, there are a couple of very good questions that you've asked, and I'm hoping this doesn't seem tangential, but I want to go just to the notion of food as information. Food is informing the body as to the environment. It's a very important environmental cue. And the reason that's important is because what we're suffering from today is an evolutionary environmental mismatch. And what I mean by that is that our DNA has evolved over hundreds of thousands of years with the sole purpose of making sure we're healthy, disease resistant, and that we procreate. That's how species survive. And yes, our DNA, our genes change with time to adapt to changes in our environment, to adapt to changes in food, other things around us, a temperature, for example, to give us the very best advantage so that we can survive. So in a very real sense, we're just the vessels that DNA uses to allow its survival. But that'll be for another conversation. Suddenly, in the blink of an eye, we've changed a very powerful part of our environment, meaning the food that we eat. And this sudden change, by losing out on the incredible value of fat and substituting those fat calories over the past 30 to 40 years with refined carbohydrate calories, has challenged our physiology. It's challenged our DNA. Our DNA is not in a place that it can now code for the various metabolic enzymatic pathways that will bring about good health. And this is a brand new event in our history. For 0.004 or 5% of the time on this planet, we've been eating processed foods, which I think is an oxymoron. Nothing food about it. But really, prior to, let's say 14,000 years ago, who knows when agriculture actually began, we were eating what we could either kill or what we would find on the ground, which our bodies were wonderfully adapted to. And I'm not suggesting that's what we should do today, eat food off the ground or go out and kill things, though there may not be anything really wrong with that, at least from a nutritional perspective. What I am saying is the sudden influx of bad signals, if you will, in the form of refined foods, specifically refined carbohydrates, and what have now been given the moniker of ultra-processed foods, has been our undoing. Our lifespan has begun to decline pre-COVID, I might add, for the first time in human history. That our children are predicted to have a shorter lifespan than we. Doesn't indicate a genetic change. Any meaningful change in our genome takes place over tens of thousands of years. The number that's typically quoted is 70,000 years. But what's changed is the playing field. And that suddenly demonized fat, and that happened about 30 years ago, that we've always eaten, and in its place, refined carbohydrates to make up that calorie debt that people have lost because they have been just very cavalier in excluding all fat from their diet. Now, let me go a little deeper, and that is, it's difficult for me to say that fat is bad or fat is good because it's too broad of a category. There are certainly fats that have made their way into human nutrition that are absolutely threatening, while other types of fats seem to be very salubrious. You know, the biggest event, I think, was in 1911 when Crisco was invented, a highly hydrogenated fat, modified fat, the likes of which human beings have never seen. But that said, you know, iterations of that fat continued. And these days, when you walk down the grocery store aisles and see bottles of seed oils on the shelves that are very high in linolenic acid, a pro-inflammatory omega-6, you know, that consumption of that level of pro-inflammatory fat is something that humans have never experienced. So maybe if we have time, we can unpack a little bit what it means in terms of recommendations for fat consumption. I also want to just clarify one other point, and that is, I think what you're quoting is a chart that appeared in a book I wrote in 2013, or actually I wrote before that, was published in 2013, Grain Brain. And the important takeaway is that dietary fiber that we subsequently wrote about in Brain Maker, a book about the gut bacteria, dietary fiber is by definition a carbohydrate. And I think when we're talking about eliminating all carbs from the diet, that's sure an important point because we don't want to eliminate dietary fiber. Yeah, it's a carb, but what we're talking about is this highly processed food diet, highly processed refined carbohydrates that, you know, make up the about 45% of the calorie consumption for the average American every day. We know that these highly processed or ultra processed foods, their consumption is now related to obesity and diabetes, other chronic degenerative conditions. And as of December 6th, 2022, in the journal JAMA Neurology, actually related over an 8-year period of time to fairly dramatic declines in both executive function and overall cognitive functionality as well. In comparing greater than 20% of the calories coming from these ultra processed foods versus people consuming less than 20% of their calories from ultra processed foods. And, you know, for me as a neurologist, that's very telling. Why? Because, you know, the end game for that is Alzheimer's. Sure, there are other forms of dementia. There are other manifestations of cognitive decline. But, you know, that's the diagnosis in about 6 million Americans right now. By 2050, there'll be 170 million people on the planet with Alzheimer's. So, you know, we talk about epidemics and pandemics. That's a global pandemic for sure. The point I'm making is there's no treatment of any usefulness whatsoever as we have this conversation today. And now we see data that strongly links food, in this case, ultra-processed foods, to risk for developing this untreatable condition called Alzheimer's disease through multiple mechanisms. Inflammation certainly being one of them, insulin resistance, and therefore depriving the brain of fuel being another. But, you know, to get back to your question, what changed? Industry, and, you know, the fact that we have industry creating the foods and really taking full advantage of our desires because we like salt, we like fat, we like sweet. Those are survival mechanisms. Industry modifies our foods. In fact, more than 60% of packaged foods on the grocery store shelves in America have added sweetener because we like it. It's a survival mechanism. You have a sweet tooth, like it or not. You do. I do. Everybody does. It's part of the hard drive. That's not an app that got added on early in life because mom and dad took you trick or treating. It's a survival mechanism. We light up when we consume sugar because it tells us that this is a food that might help us survive. That's how it worked until just yesterday, until a blink of an eye in our history. Now our overconsumption of sugar is, significantly responsible for the general global decline in health and risk for bad outcomes, for example, as it relates to various infectious problems as well.
Yeah, I just want to touch on that because I think whether it's an interview or one of the books that you read, that you wrote, talked about that we were both evolved, like ancestors and our typical and our humans today have evolved to seek out fat and sugar. And I thought the sugar part was quite interesting because obviously now we think of sugar as like processed sugar. So it seems like what the difference is that cavemen back in the day was only limited to certain foods that they could actually acquire, because unlike today where we can just go to a grocery store and get anything that we could possibly want with the tap of a button, what you mentioned, I think, was that the cavemen were finding fat from animals, and then they had to find like natural sugar from berries and plants. So is it that humans today and our ancestors, we haven't really changed in terms of what we crave and what we seek out? The difference is the external stimuli of what's available, so accessible to us.
I mean, the desire for salt, the desire for fat, the desire for sugar allowed us, or motivated us to seek out certain foods. And that was a powerful survival mechanism until just recently. Now, with the overabundance of those three components or flavors or tastes, whatever you want to call it, and we're giving into those desires, then, we're setting into motion survival pathways. And these survival pathways are such that they make us fatter and they make us insulin resistant, because those were good things. In a time of food scarcity, having a little bit of extra body fat and locking that body fat up so it stays on your body and helps you have a reserve of calories, powerful survival mechanism. Being drawn to sweet foods, for example, activates pathways that make and store fat and also increase de novo or production of sugar in the body, and also ratchet down our metabolism, turning down mitochondrial function so we burn less fuel and therefore we have more fuel available. The same mechanisms are involved in allowing our bodies to increase their retention of water so that we don't become dehydrated, and actually raise the blood pressure a bit as a hedge against dehydration, and allowing our blood to perfuse our organs like our brains, our heart, our liver, etc., kidneys. So these are all survival mechanisms. What I'm saying is being insulin resistant, having a higher blood sugar, gaining weight, having more body fat, not being able to burn body fat, having your energy utilization reduced, increasing your fluid reserve, etc. Those seems like bad things. And today they are. But they're good things in the context of our ancestors who didn't know where their next meal was coming from, and winter's coming, for example. It allowed survival when our ancestors made just a little bit more fat and could survive during times of food scarcity like winter. A bear knows darn well, I don't know how he knows, but they know darn well that during the winter they're not going to be able to find food as readily. So a survival mechanism for bears is they say, the heck with it. I'm not going to be out foraging for food in the dead of winter. I'm going to take a nap. And they hibernate. But prior to their hibernation, they are making and storing an incredible amount of fat as a way of powering their bodies when they go to sleep for months at a time. They're activating pathways that are basically powered by their sugar consumption. As you watch a bear get ready for hibernation, they're eating not tons, but many, many pounds of berries day in and day out. That fructose stimulates the production of something called uric acid that triggers their bodies to make and store fat. Now, certain proteins can do that as well through another pathway called purines that ultimately become uric acid. But their metabolism changes such that it's telling them winter's coming. And we can do the same things to our bodies, make our bodies believe that winter's coming. We got to make and store fat. We got to raise the blood pressure. We got to raise the blood sugar and become insulin resistant when we input information into our bodies in the form of sugar. So that's a lot. It's a lot to work through. But let me back up a little bit and summarize. Our bodies crave sugar because it's a survival mechanism. When we consume sugar, we make more fat. And until quite recently, that was a good thing. Nowadays, with our excessive availability of sugar, we're making fat and storing fat, becoming insulin resistant, and raising our blood pressure. That used to be a survival mechanism.
Right. So one thing that I see missing in this chart is there's a percentage there, but the total consumption amount in general is something that I'm curious about. So for example, like let's say an average person consumes 1,500 to 2,000 calories per day. And I'd be curious to know, like, if the biggest differences between our carbs versus fat consumption is that just on our typical Western diet, we just eat like 2 to 3 times more than our ancestors' diet did, meaning like we actually consume similar amounts of fat that they did, except that we just added a bunch of carbs because it's cheaper, more accessible. What are the comparisons of like the actual total calories that we have consumed?
Right. So what you're looking at then in animal studies and in humans are studies where you might have 2 or 3 different groups, and they are experiencing what we call an isocaloric intervention, meaning all groups, whether it's 2 or 3 or however many, are eating the same number of calories per day. And what you find is when those calories are more derived from fat, that there is less weight gain, and certainly depending on the amount of calories that are consumed, or perhaps even more weight loss in comparison to those that are eating more refined carbohydrates as making up those calories. We certainly see that in the rodent model. And so the point is that this notion of calories in versus calories out, if you just eat less calories, you're going to lose weight, doesn't necessarily play out. The idea is a calorie is not a calorie. There's a huge difference in terms of what we've been talking about, in terms of brain signaling and physiology signaling, metabolism signaling, based on a calorie of fat derived from fat or a calorie derived from sugar. Sugar puts into play survival mechanisms, and fat calories are the currency, if you will, of kind of the day-to-day activity. That's what we burn and store. Generally, sugar is what we burn day to day. That's the currency of what we burn, and fat is what we store. So, in terms of what we consume, then, if, in recognizing that a calorie is not a calorie, there are profound advantages these days for people who are having trouble losing their weight or trouble getting their blood sugar under control, to eating more good fat calories and cutting back on the refined calories. It's really quite straightforward. I mean, this study that came out very recently, as I mentioned, in JAMA Neurology, showing, dramatic increased risk of cognitive decline in people eating this ultra-processed food. One of the things that does is it increases insulin resistance and causes the body to be less able to use insulin in all of its various functions, not just for storing blood sugar into glycogen, but actually in terms of how it acts as a trophic hormone or a nurturing hormone in the brain. When we compromise insulin's functionality in the brain declines. And when it declines, we can measure that. That's why we have to pay attention to keeping insulin functional in the human body. And the simplest thing that we can do to nurture insulin's functionality is to stop challenging it by eating a diet that's going to raise our blood sugar.
Where did this idea of fat being so bad for us? Because I'm looking at the chart, I'm still looking at it, and it's like the differences of like the fat is so shocking for me, and still is. And I just remember growing up, especially in the early days, like in Korea, my grandmother just telling me about these things, like we would put olive oil or we would try to eat certain types of fat, and she would just warn us like, no, don't eat fat, like you're gonna get a heart attack. She would tell us to eat a bowl of rice a day. Like the differences of what I perceive to be true now for my health versus what I've been taught. And I think what a lot of people have been taught about the negative impacts of like fat is probably telling in terms of what our Western diet is today. So where did this idea spread that fat is so bad for us? And I guess who's the one that really initiated
Oh, I
this
don't
kind
want
of
to point
campaign?
fingers at Ansel Keys on the cover of Time magazine. But Ansel Keys did a study looking at various populations in various countries around the world and tried to stratify risk for certain health-related problems based upon their fat consumption, and concluded that higher fat consumption was related to higher risk of various types of health problems. And industry seized upon that and began, because industry finds it much easier to make sugar enriched, what a terrible word, sugar laden products in comparison to fat, because fat goes rancid. It doesn't really make for good manufacturing.
Right.
Sugar,
like cereal and all that.
You bet.
Right.
So, but, beginning in the late 1960s and early 1970s, in the best journals that we read, the Journal of the American Medical Association, the New England Journal of Medicine, were study after study demonizing fat. And doctors began preaching fat is the enemy. We began seeing miraculously at the same time the appearance of various low-fat foods, on the grocery store shelves, low-fat cookies and cakes and pies, and it became an obsession in America and spread, to various other countries around the world that were kind of following the so-called Western diet. That fat was, if you ate fat, terrible things would happen. You were at great risk for a heart attack. And it was only, a few years back when suddenly it was realized that, the dirty laundry was aired, that there was an incredible relationship between industry and these seemingly peer-reviewed, impartial scientific journals, that they were profoundly influential through their donations, through their support of research, that the researchers were receiving funds, etc., because the narrative that fat was bad and sugar was your friend was very attractive, because the public loved it. It was eat more sugar and fat was easier to avoid. And then industry, of course, followed, and it worked hand in hand. And it continues. I was recently interviewed a few years back on a national morning program. And on that program, I had just revised a book called Grain Brain, and we did a 5-year revision. And the interviewer said, in your book, Dr. Perlmutter, you talk about that sugar consumption is bad for the brain and kind of threatens our health. And then they said, well, but we reached out to the sugar industry and they told us, and they made a big graphic right behind me saying sugar consumption in moderate amounts is okay. Science proves that. And I'm thinking, here we are, 2 decades later, and you're still giving in to this because, you have ads sponsored by various companies that have sugar-laden products. And I said, let's stop right there. You're telling me that your resource for challenging my views on sugar come from the sugar industry. And I said, that's pretty much like asking the tobacco industry at a time when they were telling us we should all smoke, remembering when they said that tobacco was good for our health, cigarettes were good for our health. And then we moved on. But, it's up to us then to sound the clarion call that there is an issue here. There's a snake in the woodpile. We've got to identify it. We have to do our best to be as objective as we can with scientific data that is as unbiased as possible, and then give the public what we believe is our best take on the information. Then ultimately, people can make their own decisions. But I think to be fair to the public, they have to hear the other side of the story. So to that end, we wrote an op-ed letter. Dr. Casey Means and I wrote a letter on February 21st, 2021 to President Biden at a time when the 5-year plan from the United States Department of Agriculture was published, saying that it's okay to get 10% of your daily calories from sugar, from pure sugar. Wow, that's what's published. That is the governmental recommendation right now for the next 4 years. And we said, dear President Biden, that almost every scientist on that committee indicated that we needed no more than 5% of our calories from sugar. And yet, so again, what is the influence of industry on even what our government says and does? So again, I'm grateful that you and I are having this chat today, and it gives me an opportunity to let your viewers hear at least another side of this story, this argument.
Yeah, I mean, that's why these open discourses are so powerful, because, I mean, just the story that I mentioned to you about the education that I got from my grandma, and this not only impacts the current generation, but because there isn't such a good nutrition education system in high school, elementary, I never took a nutrition class. All of my information came from parents, just like how religion is passed down, or just how certain things, cultural norms are passed down. And nutrition, I think, is no different. So because of that, I think this open discourse is so useful for really just getting the facts straight, or at least having a discussion on getting different sides of the aspect. So related to that, I would love to just dig deeper into what are healthy fats, because I still think this public consumption of like what fat is, they kind of relate it to like French fry oil and that being like a bad thing for you. So that they're, if you see any ad around like fat, that's kind of what they're going to put, right? They're going to put the most nasty types of thing that is related to technically fat, which is, the worst kind of fat. And they'll just make it such as a general thing, just like the war on drugs, that they put marijuana with all of these different types of drugs that are very different. So talk to us a little bit about what are the good types of fats that we should be eating.
And what makes it so challenging is nobody wants to be fat, and it seems simple to connect being fat with eating fat, right? I mean,
true.
We've often said that maybe we'll just eliminate the middleman and just apply whatever dietary fat directly to our hips and be done with it. But again, fat has always been a central part of human nutrition. Important, and a lot of that was animal fat, and we do pretty darn well on animal fat. There's a sense that eating saturated fat, for example, is going to be a health threat. Well, that's not what the medical literature, by and large, is telling us. That saturated fat turns out not to be the health threat that it was thought to be, or at least people were trying to convince us it was. I think the more processed a fat is, the worse it is for us. I think when you look at the types of fats that people consume, by and large, the most common type of fat, exogenous or non-animal related fat, would be the seed oils, corn oil, various types of oil, safflower, etc., cottonseed oil, soybean oil. These are so common on the grocery store shelves, sitting there on the grocery store shelf for months, if not years. And yet we are kind of convinced that that's a good, healthy oil. There's, a picture of whatever plant it came from on the label. And, we're told corn oil is going to be good for us because it's higher in polyunsaturated fats. At least that was the messaging years ago.
Yeah.
But what we do understand is that these fats, these seed oils, for example, are very high in omega-6 fatty acids, and that those tend to be pro-inflammatory. They tend to initiate and propagate inflammation in the human body. We'll talk in a moment in terms of why that matters. But, there are various ratios comparing the, in my opinion, less healthy, but nonetheless necessary omega-6 oils in comparison to the healthful omega-3s that we talk about as being good for us. And it's been said that the general consumption ratio of omega-6 to omega-3 now in America is about 20-1. And that what our ancestors consumed was more in the range of 3 or 4 or 5-1. And that, some indications were that we would consume twice as much, or 2-1 ratio, omega-6 to omega-3. So,
right now it's 20 omega-6, 1 omega-3.
That's right. Who knows what our ancestors would have consumed, nor do we know what is ideal. But I think we're eating far too much of the omega-6 pro-inflammatory types of fats. It's making for the building of our cell membranes being less functional. It's amping up inflammation in the human body. And we know that, that level of chronic uptick of inflammation is associated mechanistically with so many of our chronic degenerative conditions, like Alzheimer's, coronary artery disease, diabetes, obesity, and even types of cancer, for example. So we want to do what we can to ratchet down inflammation, and certainly paying attention to the types of fats that we consume, favoring the types of fats like olive oil, avocado oil, and even fats that are coming from animals are worthwhile. Now, the question is, what about dairy products? Some people have a real issue with casein, and I recognize that, and they shouldn't be consuming casein. But I think on balance, I far more likely recommend fat from dairy products than I would the standard omega-6 type fat consumption that people are engaged in day in and day out. And you mentioned, the oil, the French fries and frying in the oil. You get an order of that, and then you get ketchup and put it on. You're getting the sucrose /fructose in the ketchup, and this oil that has been in that fryer, for the last 7 hours. And it's a combination that really is quite health threatening. It doesn't mean that there aren't ways of frying foods that are less threatening. It doesn't mean that potatoes are necessarily a bad food. But, there's the devil in the details in terms of how that food is prepared and in what context is it consumed. So, taking a potato, cutting it up, and then cooking it, there are ways of making so-called French fries. But, a lot of the fast food French fries that's not how they make them. They're extruded. The stuff that they make, this big glob of clay that gets extruded through a screen to make it look like they're French fries, then into the oil that's been sitting there for hours and hours, that does not make for a healthy food.
So from a healthy fat perspective, you would recommend olive oil because it has less omega-6, avocado oil, I guess avocado in general, olives in general. Those are just oil versions of those natural states. Would you recommend like coconut oil and grass-fed butter as well when you're cooking?
That's right, and ghee.
And ghee, okay.
Clarified butter, organic.
I've also heard that with olive oil, you can only cook it to a certain temperature. So if you cook it too high compared to like coconut oil, which can withstand more, it actually is negative for you. Is that?
That's right. You don't want. You really want to pay attention to the smoke point, and that is, by definition, the temperature at which an oil starts to burn and turn into smoke. I mean, olive oil can be used, for example, to lubricate the wok, because wok cooking is generally two things. It's generally at lower temperature cooking in a wok. And also, a lot of the cooking that takes place in the wok is actually steaming. What you do when you cook vegetables in the wok is you add water, or unless it's a vegetable that has a lot of water, you add water, put the lid on, and you're kind of steaming those vegetables. Unlike what you might get at an Oriental restaurant when you have a seemingly wok-cooked stir fry, where you can taste that the oils have been burned. You taste it, very well. And so it's really what you choose to do. So in many ways, wok cooking is actually steaming. Coconut oil has a much higher smoke point, and therefore, is also useful in that regard. But the idea of any food sitting in bubbling oil to get cooked is really something, fat is very, very delicate. It really is very sensitive. So the notion of basically cooking in fat and heating up a fat is worrisome because it does modify the fat in such a way that it becomes less healthful.
Yeah, the crazy thing is, I know people that have adjusted their taste buds to like smoked oils or smoked fat from things like Chinese food, because our taste buds have just adjusted. So like if they don't have that taste, it's almost like it's not Chinese food for them. And it's hard for them to adjust, to know what actual healthy food is. It's like kind of our way of adjusting to what we think junk food is, or what, tasty food is.
You're right. Like so here's what we've got then. We've got a situation in which our brains are hardwired for us to eat bad food. It's the way it is. Why? The brain wants us to eat, let's say, sugar. It, as I mentioned earlier, it's a powerful, powerful survival mechanism that has served us for 99.999% of our time on this planet. No, sorry, 99.996% of our time on this planet.
A lot.
Somebody call me on this. 99.0. Anyway,
Yeah.
and because that allowed us to gravitate towards ripened fruit. When does fruit ripen? Fruit ripens in the late summer and early fall, prior to winter. Perfect system. Late summer, early fall, starting to get cold. Fruit is starting to get ripe. We eat that high sugar. Starch has turned into sugar food. And it triggers our bodies to do what? Make fat. Why? Because winter's coming. It's a beautiful system. We're right in time with nature, in tune with nature. We make a little bit more fat in the fall because of our consumption of whatever modest amounts of ripened fruit we're able to come upon. We make a little bit more fat, and then during the dead of winter, when we can't kill something or find something, we have a reserve. We survived, and those that didn't eat the sugar don't pass on they didn't have the sweet gene, so they didn't get to survive and therefore procreate. We therefore have a brain that is telling us, eat sweet, eat fat, eat salt, expand your blood pressure. And eating salt is a powerful mechanism because when we eat a lot of salt, our bodies think they are dehydrated. The serum sodium, the salt level, goes up when we eat a lot of salt. And that's a signal to the brain that we are dehydrated. When you're dehydrated, your sodium goes up because it becomes more concentrated. And our brain thinks now we can't find water. So it puts into play various mechanisms that ultimately, through, oddly enough, production of fructose and then uric acid, it tells our bodies to make fat. Now, why would that be a good thing? Because when we are dehydrated, this mechanism goes into place and tells our body to make fat. Why in the world would that be a good thing? Well, the reason that makes sense, let's look at the camel, for example. Now, you're probably scratching your head right now going, where is Dr. Perlmutter taking this conversation? The most unique characteristic of this animal that can walk for weeks across the desert and not get dehydrated is it has a hump, right? And what's inside the hump? Water, a big 30-gallon container of water. Well, the reality is that's not true. That's not its a unique trick. Its unique trick is if you open up the camel's hump, it's fat. Fat, when we and the camel and other animals metabolize fat, it becomes two things. It becomes carbon dioxide that we exhale, and it becomes what we call metabolic water. So making that body fat, when our bodies think that they are dehydrated because we are consuming a lot of salt, which makes our body think it's dehydrated, which turns on fat production, is how we increase the availability of water, because then we burn that fat and we create metabolic water and we blow off the CO2. Look how fat the whales are. They don't find springs and drink from springs underwater. You know, when the hummingbird's getting ready to take this epic 1,000-mile flight, if you want hummingbirds in your backyard, what do you put there? Sugar. That sugar says to the hummingbird's physiology, make fat. And when it's ready to make its journey, 40% of its body weight is fat. The hummingbird is fat because it then burns the fat, and it's useful for calories, and it also makes metabolic water. So it's the reason then that parking yourself in front of the TV on a Sunday to watch the game and eating a big bag of salted pretzels is a bad move, because that salt raises your serum sodium, tells your body it's dehydrated, and that turns on mechanisms that, because of your body's thought that it's dehydrated, to make fat. Because then when you burn that fat, you're going to create water because your body thinks it needs it.
Now I'm thinking about this genius marketer that I remember at a college bar who would feed us the saltiest popcorns for free.
Of course.
And everybody would go there because obviously that's probably the place I order the most beers too, just because I was just so thirsty. And I was like, oh my God, it's free popcorn? You're this broke college student? It all makes sense now.
We had that in high school, actually. There was one place that would do that, actually, and hot dogs too. And we were, gosh, I was 14 in high school. So yeah, I was 14. So they would let me in. It was great.
No fake IDs.
No, they didn't need it. They didn't ask for an ID, though I had one. Truth be known, the statute of limitations is over on that one. David Wayne Will was my pseudonym. I had to memorize it because they would always ask if you ever use it. What's your name and what's your birthday?
That's funny. I wanted to also, because you mentioned sweets, so fruits is something that I have this weird relationship with. So I had Dr. Stephen Gundry on the show, and he's a big proponent and a microphone around not eating fruits, like at all. And I'd love to get your thoughts on this, because obviously the upside of fiber, vitamin C comes with some of the downsides of, fructose, according to him. And I'm wondering if because sometimes I always look at like, what are the symmetric risk to reward? Like, can we get the same reward without the risks? And I'm wondering if we can get the similar benefits of fruits, like vitamin C from cruciferous vegetables like broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage.
You can, but let's unpack this a little bit. So Dr. Gundry is a very close personal friend. We've been on each other's podcasts multiple times, and it's great that we have discussions because it's so respectful. And I think it's a question of the amount that you consume. A bear getting ready to hibernate is eating berries all day long, pounds and pounds of berries. An apple might contain 5 grams of fructose, and that's not a lot. In fact, that 5-gram load of fructose in the human gut is not even enough to make it to the liver. It's after about 5 grams that the spillover of fructose then goes to the liver and is metabolized in such a way that it becomes uric acid and sets the stage for metabolic mayhem. So we can handle that 5 grams easily, and it comes packaged in such a way that it contains fiber, it contains vitamin C, it contains bioflavonoids, and all of that. The fiber slows the fructose absorption. The vitamin C and the bioflavonoids actually work to reduce uric acid. So an apple a day is reasonable. Maybe 2 apples a day, totally reasonable. Some blueberries. There are some fruits like a melon and watermelon, a honeydew melon and watermelon, for example, that are really high in fructose and maybe have some, but you don't really want to go overboard. But what is not reasonable is the notion of drinking a 12-ounce glass of fruit juice. Why? Because A, you don't get the fiber, and B, you're bombarding your body with 36 grams of sugar. You might as well drink the Coke, because you're bombarding your body with a sudden onslaught of sugar. It takes a while to eat an apple, right? But you can down a 12-ounce glass of orange juice. If you're thirsty, you can down that in 15 seconds, right? Or whether it's a cola or orange juice or apple juice, whatever it may be, especially if you're thirsty. So that overwhelms this small intestinal ability to deal with that 5 grams of fructose I mentioned earlier. And as such, then that fructose makes its way to the liver, where all the downstream effects begin. Fructose, through an enzyme called fructokinase, is ultimately metabolized in an energy-consuming series of reactions to form uric acid. And uric acid is the body's alarm system telling the body that winter is coming. That's what happens when you drink a 12-ounce glass of orange juice or that soda, or really go overboard on fruit consumption. You're telling your body to prepare for winter. You're activating uric acid pathways that increase fat production, that lock up fat and keep it from being able to be utilized as an energy source, that actually damage mitochondrial function as a survival mechanism so that we're not using as much energy and we're keeping the energy as a resource, that are inhibiting the function of something called nitric oxide that keeps the blood vessels clamped down and inhibits insulin from doing its job as survival mechanisms. And, again, that's food as information. That's fructose signaling your body through uric acid to prepare for food scarcity.
That's crazy. So would you say that a glass of orange juice or an apple juice has similar amounts of fructose as like a Coca-Cola drink
It
or a
does.
Sprite
It has
drink?
about 36 grams of
That's
sugar.
insane.
And yeah, I mean, here you've been told all these years, you go to a restaurant for breakfast in a nice hotel, do you want a glass of juice? And they'll stand there with the pitcher ready to go because everybody knows we should start our day with 36 grams of sugar prior to the stack of pancakes over which we're going to pour maple syrup. And the likelihood of that being actual maple syrup, though would you like some maple syrup on your pancakes? The likelihood of that being maple syrup, it's syrup, but the likelihood of being maple syrup is slim and none. And then you pour sugar, highly refined sugar over your pancakes, and the next thing you know, your blood sugar is spiked, your uric acid goes up, your body's in this state where it thinks it needs to store fat, and you're damaging how insulin is able to do its job, and setting the stage for these issues that we talk about that are related to our food consumption, the chronic degenerative conditions like the heart disease, the diabetes, the obesity, and some forms of cancer that are ranked by the World Health Organization as the number one cause of death on our planet, not COVID.
Wow. What's happening there though? Like if I got like a 6 slices of fresh orange, and I squeezed it into a glass, would that still have similar amounts of fructose? Or
Yes.
Are you saying is because people add, like the companies add added sugar,
That's why as well. There are all kinds of these, and I'm not going to use names, but they look like orange juice, and you see them on the grocery store shelves. And I know of one, I'm thinking of it right now, but it has some orange juice, and they'll say made from fresh oranges. Yeah, right. And then water and sugar to flesh it out. High fructose corn syrup is very, very sweet, and it's very, very cheap. It was first the technique for making fructose from or high fructose corn syrup from corn was actually developed, I think, in 1957 by Dr. Richard O'Malley at the University of Oklahoma, and it was aggressively seized upon because it's a simple technique. Corn is abundant and cheap and subsidized, and here's a way of sweetening food and getting away with it. It's sweet, so give me another glass. I just down that glass of orange juice, and orange juice has got to be good for me. Give me another couple of glasses. Keep it coming because you can't stop. Sugar doesn't signal your satiety center. It doesn't tell you that it's time to stop eating and drinking. Fat does. That's the reason that we, are so fond of adding fat to all 3 meals, because it really works quite quickly in terms of signaling in your brain that you've had enough, push yourself away from the table. Sugar does just the opposite. That's why, at the end of the meal, they serve you dessert and you want to keep it coming. Bingo. All of a sudden you've got that sweet on board. You cannot stop.
That to me is probably a bigger lie than what the grain industry has done with cereal or bread, because the logical part of our brain would associate fruits as good. Eat an apple to keep eat an apple a day to keep doctor away. All of these things that we've been taught, and you put that in liquid form, and our brains will automatically think this is something that is healthy for us. Whereas, I could see a lot of people thinking, okay, eating cereal, it's not really good. It also makes you tired often after. Whereas drinking orange juice, it gives you this burst of energy because of the sugar guy. It is so confusing, I think, for a lot of people. And I know friends that,
but that's why we do our very best to really unpack this and let people understand what is going on. A, what's going on in your body and in your brain in terms of your choices, and B, how that has been hijacked for financial gain on the part of people who are selling you this crap in the first place. So, what happens when you start consuming sweet foods? You can't stop. I mean, that's why people binge on Oreos or whatever it may be. Who ever heard of somebody binging on avocados? A high-fat food. You don't binge on steak. Who binges on steak? I mean, if you're not eating anything else, that's all you have. Okay, you're going to eat it. But nobody does a binge. Nobody's going to binge on because that fat in meat is satisfying your satiety center.
Yeah. I want to shift towards what you mentioned before, which is uric acid. You have a whole book around this. I want to make sure we really have some time to dig into this. And then I want to end it off with what we think, what an ideal diet would be for someone looking to improve their brain health and just in general. But uric acid. So I associate uric acid with gout, which is like this very painful arthritis. But you go way deeper into what other impacts it can have on our health. So what is uric acid and what are the things that it's damaging to our health?
Well, let me start and then I'll backpedal. I'm going to start by saying that uric acid is a powerful alarm signal in the body that food scarcity is coming. It's preparing our physiology and shifting our physiology to get ready for winter or to get ready or to have a hedge against starvation. And as we'll learn in a moment, predation as well, in other words, becoming the meal for some other animal. So uric acid is the end product of the metabolism of fructose. When fructose is metabolized, when alcohol is metabolized in the body, and when a certain group of chemicals called purines, which are a breakdown of DNA and RNA found in foods and found in the body as well, then ultimately uric acid is formed. So when we consume foods that lead to elevation of the uric acid, it puts into play mechanisms that increase our body fat, that increase our blood pressure, that decrease our utilization of body fat as a fuel, and increase our insulin resistance, so our blood sugar goes up. And again, these are all good things. We want to get fatter. We want to have a higher blood pressure. We want to have more blood sugar. And as a survival mechanism in the day, but not now. So,
right.
When we understand that, when you understand this relationship now of elevated uric acid to these metabolic issues that are so central to why people are sick these days, it's a long way away from gout and kidney stones, which is what most healthcare practitioners looked at uric acid in the context of representing that player as it related to gout and kidney. I know for a fact that's what we were taught, that, uric acid has to do with gout and kidney stones. Here's the medicine to lower it. Let's move on. Well, this is brand new information that uric acid is related to other issues, metabolic issues. We only started to hear about this in 1898. When the first book on these other relationships with uric acid was published by Dr. Alexander Haig, indicating that we need to consider the role of elevated uric acid in metabolic issues, in headache and depression, in cognitive issues as well. Nobody paid really much attention to that until the past couple of decades. In 2016, a really powerful overview study paper was written, a collaborative study with Japanese and Turkish researchers. The title was basically the role of uric acid in metabolic syndrome, from innocent bystander to a central player. Meaning, we've seen elevated uric acid in relationship to blood pressure issues and blood sugar issues and obesity for many, many years. We've known that. But they were calling attention to the fact that it's not just happening to be elevated in these conditions, it's actually playing a mechanistic role in causing these problems. That's profound. And since that time, that was 2016, how it does so, has been teased apart. The mechanisms are very clear. We can get into the weeds a bit and talk about the role of elevated uric acid in damaging how insulin works, in raising blood pressure, in damaging how cells are able to utilize fat so that we keep our fat around our bellies for a longer period of time. But let's simplify it by simply saying it's important then to keep uric acid levels in check. We do that first by knowing what our uric acid levels are, meaning that we ask our doctor, please check my uric acid level. No, I know I don't have gout, but nonetheless, I'm interested to know, and I'd like to keep my level below 5.5, not 7.0, which is what most labs are going to say is the cutoff for normal versus abnormal. That relates to gout. 5.5 relates to risk for cardiometabolic issues.
Gotcha. So that's so fascinating. And you said 2000, so just about 6 years ago, we realized that uric acid is actually the causation, or at least of a significant, maybe not significant, but it is some sort of a contributor to a lot of the major issues that we have, like high blood pressure and obesity. It's not just a secondary consequence of these other things that we had.
Right. It is a downstream event that helps us understand why eating more ultra-processed foods, eating more refined carbohydrates, lack of physical activity, not getting enough sleep, all these things, there's a uric acid explanation for all of them. It's not the only thing, but it's a critical metabolic marker like blood pressure, like fasting blood sugar, like insulin levels, like triglyceride levels, like ApoB, and other metabolic markers that we need to pay attention to. It's not the end all, that's for sure, but it needs to take its place amongst those other metabolic markers.
Well, I think the majority of the people, at least I certainly haven't heard of how important uric acid is, or uric acid levels. So I'm gonna definitely check that in my annual blood check. And 5.5 is what we want to aim for. This relates to kind of this last question around what you would recommend from just an ideal diet perspective, and maybe we can wrap this around.
Sure.
What are some of the things that we should be eating to lower our uric acid levels, to have more energy, all of these different things?
And I there are a lot of diets out there. There are a lot of trends: keto, paleo, vegan, vegetarian, pescatarian, all these diets, and there are upsides to a lot of them. A diet that's the standard American diet, the acronym is SAD, oddly enough, where 40% of your calories are from ultra-processed foods. There's something critically wrong with that. I can't get my arms around it. But the other things I mentioned, there are upsides. I like the fact that the diet should have a lot of good fiber. There's no fiber in animal products. So the idea of focusing only on animal products, being just a carnivore, I think is threatening because of the lack of dietary fiber. I think vegetables are very important. Fruits and vegetables of various colors with various phytonutrients, really important, helping to bring down uric acid, helping to nurture the gut bacteria, helping to keep blood sugar in check. If people like to consume animal products like meat, I think that's, for them, not unreasonable, but I think we should limit our consumption to 6 or 8 ounces a day. Other animal products like eggs, I'm a big fan of eggs. I consume them most days. Cheese, I try to make sure that cheese is organic. I don't believe I have a casein issue, so I do consume cheese. But I think the broad strokes are best evaluated in looking at how you as an individual respond in certain biometrics to the foods that you are consuming. Measure your fasting uric acid level. Measure your fasting blood sugar, or even better, get a continuous glucose monitor and know what your blood sugar is doing every minute of the day based upon your activity, not just the foods that you eat. So I think that, as we conclude, it ultimately, Sean, depends on what is your food doing for you and how can you measure it? How wonderful it is that we live in a time where we have answers for that.
I wonder, though, just as a counterpoint to that, are there some consequences of short-term versus long-term consequences? Because I know a lot of people that would eat meat, let's say, only, and they feel amazing. But I wonder what the long-term consequences of that, meaning, like, should we always rely on what like these short-term metrics or...
No, not at all.
Feelings?
And in fact, think about it. There are times in our history when that's all we had, in the course of a month or a year. And then there were times that our diets would shift quite dramatically based on what we could find or kill. So I think we have, human physiology is exceedingly flexible and exceedingly resilient. And, a lot of that resilience is based upon the diversity of gut microbes that we harbor, which change quite readily in the face of our dietary changes as an adaptation, allowing us to be resilient. And no question, people do feel short-term benefits from any, particular diet. Going full on keto might help people lose weight in the short term. And there's a benefit to that. And then phasing in, other types of foods, more as a maintenance plan. So there's a time and a place for short-term, aggressive, strict dietary interventions, especially when you're trying to put people back on the rails.
All right. Well, David, I really appreciate your time. I learned a lot just from this episode, and I know a lot of people did as well. So where can people find you online? Where can people learn more
Let's
about
see,
you?
Dr. Perlmutter, drperlmutter.com would be the best place to start. And that'll lead you to my Instagram site and Facebook. And certainly the Empowering Neurologist is our podcast. So that'd be a great place to go as well.
Okay. Well, I'll link all of that below. Hopefully everyone can check that out. And again,
Great.
thank you so much for
Thank
your
you,
time.
Sean. Thank you for having me.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.